Welcome back everybody to our study of metaphysics. In this final lesson on the subject of ontology, what I want to do is spend some time talking about the study of meta-ontology. We'll just talk a little bit about what meta-ontology is, the ways in which meta-ontology might help us understand the broader context of ontology generally, and then finish by examining something known as sparse ontology as well, a position of an ontological position. And we'll also look a little bit at the idea of Occam's razor as a method of ontological commitments. So, like I said, this is the final lesson on the subject of ontology. We're going to be moving on next to the subject of objects and properties in the next lessons. But for now, we will look at the concept of what is known as meta-ontology, and we will also finalize some of the subsidiary issues relating to ontological commitments. This is and has been something of a broad overview topic on the subject of ontology. I should make it very clear for reference that in the future we may well, very likely in fact, do a whole series of lessons on just the subject of ontology, and the various different approaches, commitments, histories, theories, and ideas as like a very advanced subject within metaphysics. That is likely going to be something that we do, but for now this topic in metaphysics is just going to be going through each of the major topics of metaphysics before we then go into the advanced subjects in later videos. So for now, we are just taking a broad overview of ontology, and so these lessons have tried to, insofar as possible, reflect that kind of approach. So, what do we mean when we talk about meta-ontology? What is meta-ontology? Well, meta-ontology, as the name suggests, is the study of how one conducts ontology. So it is the study of ontology, but the study of how one does ontology, essentially. And a view in ontology is a view about what things exist, what things we ought to be ontologically committed to, which statements we ought to be ontologically committed to. And we've been talking in a lot of ways about how, particularly the philosopher Quine, actually derives his principles for how he would approach how to understand what things ought to be an ontological commitment. This idea of regimentation, for example, the process of turning something into first order logic, and then where there are clashes and where there are problems that may cause you to commit to things that you might not necessarily want to commit to in terms of existence, you may want to paraphrase, use a method of paraphrase, which was what the previous lesson examined. A view in meta-ontology, however, is a view about what one is doing or ought to be doing when they are engaging in an ontological debate. When we are talking about ontology, what ought to be the case, what ought one do, and how should this whole approach be tackled? In a similar way that when we talk about ethics and the subject of moral philosophy, we're talking often about how one ought to act in a certain situation, how one ought to be, what decisions one ought to make that are the most ethical decisions for them. But then a subject and a study of metaethics is a broader conversation that is not necessarily about specific instances of morality, but is more so talking about conversations in relation to what it means to say something is right or wrong, what it means to say something is moral or immoral, where does morality derive? All of these different things are meta-ethical debates. This is a meta-ontological debate, okay? So what we have been doing is the meta-ontology of the Quinean method of ontological commitments. That's essentially what the subject that we have been engaging ourselves in. But what we haven't been doing is necessarily ontology itself, but rather trying to find a system by which one can have ontological commitments. It's almost a normative ontology that we're doing, a theory of trying to develop a system of ontology and ontological commitments that we can then apply to any situation that we want to in terms of making decisions about what we believe to exist. So, given that this is what we've been doing, let's see if we can apply some of the Quinian principles to finding ontological commitments. Let's see if we can actually just finish off this series of lessons on ontology by doing something like this. Fundamentally, what is the correct way, should I say, to find sentences that one takes to be true? That is the question that I wish to ask here. What do we mean by this? Well, according to Quine, what we are looking for in ontology is similar to what we are looking for in science, in a similar sense. Okay, in science, what we are trying to do is search for good scientific theories, and one of the things that is useful in science is to try and make sure that these good scientific theories are simple. So, what do we mean when we talk about simplicity in terms of good scientific theories? Well, what Quine says is that taking the concept of simplicity is a very important part of the process of finding ontological commitments, okay? And he believes that we should start with what he would term the simplest conceptual scheme. And the reason for this is then you can then build up and build on to some of the more detailed and more difficult stuff that we can try and find ontological commitments for. You might be familiar with this idea. Because what this idea is, trying to find the simplest conceptual scheme and the simplest explanation for events and things things taking place. This is Occam's razor, a theory developed by medieval philosopher and theologian William of Occam. When it comes to the theories of approaching ontological commitments, okay, it is fundamentally Occam's razor is fundamentally an ontological tool that one may use to try and come to determinations about what the correct course of action is in terms of a belief system. So what Occam's razor essentially tells us, the theory of Occam's razor, simply states that entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity. Okay. Now, this is in Latin, this particular phrase, in a lesson that I did on law over on the Law Academy a few days ago. I tried to read out some Latin and it failed dramatically, so I'm not even going to attempt to do this. I'm not Latin. I don't speak Latin. This is the Latin phraseology. Take it for what it is. But what does how could we understand Occam's razor in a more simple way of thinking about it? Well, one of a really good way of understanding Occam's razor, at least in my opinion, was reference to an old Vsauce video. So Vsauce, of course, is a very famous YouTuber who makes a number of various videos about interesting things, generally speaking. And he was talking about a theory within ontology and a theory within philosophy more generally, known as last Thursdayism. Now, what last Thursdayism tells us is that it is a belief, a philosophical belief, that the universe, the world that we live on right now, all of our memories, everything that exists in the world in reality was created last Thursday. This is what last Thursdayism tells us, okay? And fundamentally, the problem with last Thursdayism is that it is fundamentally unfalsifiable. You cannot prove it to be wrong. You also cannot prove it to be right either, because any evidence that you can call up as being part of evidence against the idea of last Thursdayism could automatically then just form part of the conspiracy, shall we say, that everything was created last Thursday. So, for example, if I say, well, things can't have been created last Thursday because I have memories of when I was 10 years old, and that was longer than last Thursday. Well, a last Thursdayist, somebody who believes in this particular theory, would say, well, that may be the case, but those memories, your memories of that, came into existence last Thursday. The complete state of reality and the state of existence all came into existence last Thursday. And fundamentally, there is nothing that you can say to prove that that is wrong, or even to prove that that is right. It is unfalsifiable. Now, the way in which a philosopher would tackle these kinds of problems is to resort to an understanding of Occam's razor. Because given the fact that, according to Occam's razor, we should not multiply entities beyond their necessity, we're essentially doing what Quine is suggesting. We are looking for the simplest conceptual scheme. What is more simple? What requires fewest assumptions, the fewest number of assumptions? A, the idea that the universe developed in the way that we understand it did 13.8 billion years ago. Over time, planets began to emerge, and that history began to develop as we know it, and that my 10 years birthday or whatever it was happened when I was 10 years old, and many years have passed since then, and we are now talking about this conversation now. Is that more likely than the idea that everything came into existence last Thursday? According to Occam's razor, the former is far more simple in terms of a conceptual scheme than the latter, because what you have to do with the latter is make a number of assumptions. You have to assume that everything that we know about time is wrong. You have to assume that everything that we know about the past didn't actually happen. They all just came into existence last Thursday. And so these multiple assumptions will push one and direct an individual to be more likely to be inclined to understand the most simple conceptual scheme. That's one way of understanding Occam's razor fundamentally. I want to finish then on this idea of sparse ontology. Okay, Quine. This is finally what we're going to talk about in terms of a Quinean method of ontological commitments. Quine did believe that we should be attracted to this idea of what he calls sparse ontology. An ontology, a type of ontology that posits a small number of types of entities, that really doesn't make too many bold statements and make too many crazy and wild ideas relating to the commitments of me to my commitment, should I say, to a my commitments to a number of different things that we want to believe in. He believed that we should be limiting, insofar as possible, our commitments to as many things as possible. And we can obviously contrast this with what is known as abundant ontology. And abundant ontology, of course, posits a large number of assumptions rather than a shorter number of assumptions. Quine believes that you should move closer towards the idea of sparse ontology, mainly as a matter of taste. Sorry, not as a matter of taste, but as a genuine method of philosophical inquiry. He argues that the more entities that you can have an ontological commitment towards, the more assumptions you have to make about reality in order to do so, and the further away you are actually getting from actually being able to hold in your hand, if you will, the views of Occam's razor, the idea of making things as conceptually simple as humanly possible.